When you think of classic aircraft from the 1960s, one name almost always comes up first: the fantastic Concorde. This sleek supersonic airliner was gorgeous, glamorous, and became a global icon even outside of the aviation world. But at the same time that Concorde was being developed in Britain and France, Britain was also working on another airliner, one that couldn't have looked more different. Small, chubby, less flashy, but as it turns out, maybe actually more important. This was the British Aircraft Corporation BAC 111, or just the 111. It wasn't an aircraft designed to challenge speed records, and it definitely wasn't meant to dazzle celebrities on transatlantic crossings. Instead, its mission was far more practical: to bring jet service to everyone, everywhere. In fact, the 111 quickly earned the nickname the bus stop jet, because the idea was that it could literally fly into little airstrips with hardly more than a bus shelter on them, pick up a load of passengers and then shuttle them into any big city hub. An Airbus, if you like. Which is maybe a quite fitting name, as we're soon going to see. Even in its own era, the 111 also didn't really look as exotic as other contemporary jets did. But it was built with advanced engineering, rugged features and some quite forward-thinking safety systems that made it a far more important airliner than many people today realize. It went on to shape the jet age in ways that are still felt today, from democratizing short-haul jet travel to influencing the creation of one of today's largest companies. And it also eventually served as a flying laboratory for advanced flight control systems. Now, a bit over a year ago, I made a video about the Douglas DC-9, where I explained how it played a key role in making jetliners practical for regional use. But the DC-9 wasn't actually the first plane to introduce many of the features that made this possible. That honor should instead go to the BAC 111, which actually preceded both the DC-9 and the mighty Boeing 737. The 111 first flew back in 1963, right in the era of the first big intercontinental four-engine flying machines. And in sharp contrast to those, this jet was designed for short hops, 30 minutes here and an hour there, the kind of routes where speed, frequency and most of all reliability mattered more than luxury, and also fuel consumption. Now, in the early 1960s, a lot of regional airports didn't have much in the way of infrastructure. Most of them had no jet bridges, no ground power units, and sometimes not even proper terminal facilities. And the 111 was tailored perfectly to exactly that kind of environment. First, it had its own built-in air stairs. Passengers could board and disembark without waiting for ground equipment thanks to a simple set of air stairs in the rear of the fuselage, and in later versions also from a front set of similar steps. Secondly, the BAC 111 had an auxiliary power unit in the tail, something that is definitely the norm today, but a relatively new idea in the early 1960s. Having access to this APU meant that the plane's crew didn't need a generator truck to start the engines or to keep the cabin cool or warm. And this made operations possible even at airfields with virtually no support. Both of these design decisions spoke to the 111's design philosophy. It was basically self-sufficient. Pilots and cabin crew could handle turnarounds completely on their own if necessary, just like a bus stopping at a series of bus stops. Again, justifying its bus stop jet nickname. Now, the crew would typically consist of 4 crew members, 2 pilots and 2 cabin crew, but no flight engineer, and that was a very modern concept at the time, and something that the 111 did even before the Boeing 737 and the Douglas DC-9 did. When operating in and out of small airfields, the idea was that one pilot would do the walk around and set up the cockpit, whilst one of the flight attendants would stand at the top of the rear air stair, checking tickets as passengers climb on board. And while that was happening, the other pilot, presumably the first officer, would help the second flight attendant to load and unload the bags. No ground equipment was necessary to do this, since the plane's fuselage sat really low, close to the ground, which was another idea that the DC-9 and the 737 later copied. Now, to be honest here, I'm not so sure that the crews really liked operating that way with no ground support, but The airlines certainly did. Suddenly, they could offer jet service from smaller towns and secondary airports where only propeller planes had previously been possible. And for the passengers, this also meant faster journeys and a taste of the jet age, even if they lived nowhere near a big city. But designing the aircraft to operate in this manner wasn't just about convenience. The 111 also had an even bigger role to play in the airline ecosystem of the 1960s and 70s. You see, long-haul jets like the 707, the DC-8 and Britain's VC-10 were grabbing all of the headlines in that early jet-set era, but those big aircraft all had one thing in common. They obviously needed big airports, long runways and modern terminals in major cities. And in post-World War II Europe, building airports like that wasn't a big priority in many countries, many of whom could only afford that in maybe 1 or 2 cities at the most. What, however, was common back then were smaller airfields. Many of these were former grass strips that had once housed aircraft like the Spitfire, Mustang and the Messerschmitt during the war, and they still littered the landscape of England, France and Germany, for example. By the 1960s, quite a few of those old strips had been given concrete runways and could therefore offer some rudimentary service to many smaller towns, but they still often lacked any real infrastructure beyond the runway itself and maybe a small ramp area. And that was the landscape that the fully self-sufficient BAC 111 was built for. It exemplified the term feeder aircraft. The idea was simple. In your small town, you'd board a 111 at your local airfield, fly half an hour into London or Paris, and then transfer onto a long-haul jet. Now, this might sound like an obvious strategy right now, especially if you're thinking of the regionals and the mainline carriers in the United States, but back then it wasn't, and the 111 showed how it could be done. And that also brings us to the Concorde, and how the BAC 111 wasn't just meant to complement the then up-and-coming supersonic jet, but in a very real sense enabled the technologies needed to make Concorde possible. And in doing so, also helped shape the future of Europe's aviation history. But before we get to that, like I mentioned earlier, the BAC 111 had introduced some really quite ingenious firsts when it came to utility, but it would also usher in some new safety features. And if you have followed this channel for a while, you know that safety and security is one of my very top priorities. That's not just in aviation, by the way. It also includes everyday life, like personal online security, which is why you might have heard me talk about passwords and VPNs in the past. But what I'm not so sure that everybody understands is that there are actually companies out there who are legally collecting your data and then selling it on. They are called data brokers, and since what they do is legal, you have to employ different tactics to stop them, which is where today's sponsor, Delete Me, comes in. Instead of you having to spend endless hours trying to track down these brokers and asking them to stop, Delete Me will handle all of that for you. Once you've signed up, they will scan the web for any sign of your data, like your home address, phone number, email, and even sensitive stuff like bank details. And unlike other digital cleanup services, Delete Me will then verify that your data is actually on the target site before reaching out, which prevents unnecessary exposure. Now, once the data broker has been served, they are then legally obligated to delete your information, and through Delete Me, that will all happen without you having to lift a finger. Delete Me also uses their own tech to do all of the scrubbing rather than outsourcing it to third parties, which keeps things extra secure, and that's why they are trusted by professionals who can't afford information leaks, like judges, medical providers and journalists. And if my endorsement isn't enough, Wirecutter has named Delete Me as the #1 data removal service. So if you want to start removing your data from the internet today, scan this QR code or go to joindeleteme.com/mentornow and use the code mentornow for a 20% discount. That's 20% off with the code mentornow, and by doing so, you're also supporting my channel. Thank you, Delete Me. Now let's get back to the story. In Britain, the feeder role of the 111 meant that it was planned to complement the other plane that the Brits were working on, the Concorde. There's even a neat human connection between the BAC 111 and the Concorde. Brian Trubshaw, the famous British test pilot who would go on to be the first man to fly the Concorde in the UK, also worked on the 111 test program earlier in his career. Famed designer Barnes Willis also worked on both planes, and while Concorde grabbed the headlines, the 111 actually did a lot of the heavy lifting. It was the plane that made sure the jet age didn't just stop in London or Paris. Because Concorde's designers and future operators knew that the supersonic jet would need even longer runways than the long-haul jets of the 1950s and 60s, which made the feeder jet concept enabled by the 111 even more vital. So in many ways, if Concorde was the dream, the 111 was the bridge that made that dream accessible. Of course, the reality turned out a little bit different, since Concorde and mass air travel never really clicked. But it turns out that the two jets shared quite a bit more than that. The 111 may have looked like a small, no-frills jet, but mechanically it was anything but ordinary. Beneath its simple lines lay some of the most advanced construction techniques of the 1960s. Even today, the most common method of building aircraft is by pressing and riveting aluminium sheets into shape, which works fine, but can create weak points and stress concentrations around rivet holes, leading to fatigue cracks. Today, these potential weaknesses are well understood, but they do involve maintenance checks throughout the lifespan of an aircraft built that way. At the time the BAC 111 was constructed, Britain's aviation engineers were quite wary of fatigue cracking, thanks to the troubled early history of the de Havilland Comet. Now, as I've covered in a previous video, the cracks that plagued the Comet had much more to do with riveting methods and the choice of aluminium alloys used than with its square windows, as many are still blaming. Now, you'll have to watch that video for the details, but in short, BAC wanted to limit any such ill effects of riveting in the fuselage of the 111. This meant that many of the plane's structural components were instead milled from solid blocks of aluminium and then bonded together, producing stronger, smoother and more fatigue-resistant assemblies. This was actually cutting-edge work, and crucially, Concorde would later use many of those same techniques, building on what was proven during the development of the BAC 111. In essence, the 111 was deliberately overbuilt, so that it could handle tens of thousands of pressurization cycles without any significant structural fatigue. And that was obviously especially important for an aircraft that was meant to handle multiple short flights per day. For that same reason, the 111's landing gear was equally over-engineered, rated for tens of thousands of hard landings on the kind of short regional runways that it was predicted to use. And the plane's strength really shone through when things went badly wrong. Take Pan International Flight 112 back in 1971, for example. Shortly after takeoff from Hamburg, this aircraft suffered a catastrophic dual-engine failure. The pilots tried to return to the airport, but the aircraft still ended up crash landing off-airport on a German autobahn, sliding sideways into an embankment and then smashing into a bridge. It was a catastrophic accident, but remarkably only 22 passengers out of 121 people on board died in this crash. And the investigators later noted that the airframe's structure absorbed enormous forces without collapsing, giving most of the occupants a chance to walk away. Then we have the almost unbelievable story of the Philippine Airlines BAC 111 that was the target of not one, but two separate bombings back in the 1980s. In both cases, a small explosive device detonated on board in the bathroom, killing only one person, the bomber himself. The aircraft was damaged, yes, but it remained controllable, landed safely, and was then repaired and put back into service, both times. Now, the fact that an airliner could survive not just one but two intentional explosions without being written off, I think says basically everything about the 111's resilience. Its reinforced fuselage, fatigue-resistant skin and strong landing gear were great selling points, reassuring operators that the plane would last the distance. And as you've seen, they also translated into saving lives. That toughness meant that it was not only a durable workhorse, but also one of the safest airliners of its generation. And this was in an era when aviation wasn't nearly as safe as it is today. And once again, BAC's engineers were drawing on the same design culture that was then building the Concorde. Concorde was the futuristic thoroughbred, pushing speed and aerodynamics to the limit, whilst the humble 111 was the workhorse, optimized for strength and endurance. But beyond its design and structure, the BAC 111 had even more lessons for future aircraft. And as is often the case in aviation, some of those lessons would involve tragedy. The first prototype aircraft actually crashed as a result of a then unknown phenomenon known as deep stall. This is something that most T-tail airplanes are susceptible to, and which I have explained thoroughly over on the Mentour Pilot channel. But in essence, at high angles of attack, the disturbed airflow from the stalled wing can mask the airflow over the elevator and horizontal stabilizer, making recovery from the stall difficult, if not impossible. The crash of that first 111 prototype exposed the dangers of deep stall, leading BAC to invent protections that we still use today. And that includes the stick shaker that warns pilots of an impending stall, and the stick pusher, which, as the name suggests, pushes the control yoke forward and therefore forces the nose of the aircraft down to reduce the angle of attack before deep stall becomes a real issue. Now, as far as I know, to this day all commercial aircraft with a T-tail incorporates a stick pusher. Let me know in the comments if that's not the case, and while you're down there, make sure that you hit like and subscribe. Anyway, combined with its robust structure, these safety features eventually gave the 111 a great reputation for toughness and reliability. And that toughness would pay off, because the 111 remained in service for much longer than you might think. The low-fare airline Ryanair actually used it at its first jet airliner between 1988 and 1994. Many of the aircraft would go on flying for decades, passing from flag carriers to charters to African operators, with some finding roles as testbeds and corporate jets well into the 21st century. So knowing all of this, you might ask, well, why wasn't this airplane even more successful then? Well, unfortunately, all of that toughness and robustness came at a cost, literally. The 111 was very expensive for its size. The much cheaper and similarly sized DC-9 went on to sell nearly 4 times as many units over a longer production run, and the Boeing 737 then went on to become the second best-selling airliner of all time, after the Airbus A320 family. But despite its cost, the fact was that by the late 1960s, the 111 had still managed to prove itself, and BAC wasn't content to stop there. The logical next step was to go bigger, and that's exactly what the company set out to do. Their engineers began sketching on what they called the 211 and later the 311, and these were wide-bodied successors that were planned to be able to carry more passengers over longer ranges. If the 111 was meant as a bus-stop jet, the 311 was pitched as the response to the then new American tri-jets and wide-bodies, like the DC-10 and the Lockheed TriStar. And it was an ambitious design. The BAC 311 would have had a large fuselage cross-section and just 2 rear-mounted engines. It was modern, efficient, and using a configuration that heavily borrowed from the 111, with a T-tail and that same focus on robust construction. On paper, it looked like the perfect follow-up, and for a while it actually seemed within reach. BEA, British European Airways, showed some early interest, and BAC then formally unveiled the project in 1970. They pitched it not just as a new airplane, but as a way for Britain to stay independent in the face of growing European collaboration, because at that same time, France, Germany and Spain were working together on a little something called the Airbus project. Now, Britain was originally also part of this project, as we explained in a previous video, but they left when the size of that Airbus A300, which was still on the drawing board, was revised slightly, which meant that the aircraft could no longer have Rolls-Royce RB211 engines as originally planned. Now, that was a deal breaker for Britain, and hence the plan for the BAC 311, which created a little bit of a conundrum. Would Britain fund a purely national widebody, or would it rejoin the Airbus consortium and pool its resources together with Europe? Well, the UK government officially pulled the plug on the 311 in December of 1970, deciding it was just too risky to go at it alone, and the rest is history. Britain then threw its weight behind Airbus, contributing design work and, most importantly, the wing and other manufacturing expertise that would become the UK's signature contribution to the Airbus family. So even if the BAC 311 never flew, its DNA definitely did. The Airbus A300 formally launched just a few years later, benefiting from some of the expertise gained through the BAC engineers. And even the planned cross-section of the BAC 311 lived on inside of the Airbus A300. And since the Airbus A310, the A330 and the A340 all used that same fuselage cross-section, you could say that the 311's contribution still lives on to this day. In a way, if you think of the Airbus A300 as the genesis of Airbus, well then the BAC 111 is Airbus's spiritual ancestor, and along the way it even helped make the mighty Concorde a reality. Not bad for a little bus stop jet. But looking back, the BAC 111 is often treated as a footnote in the telling of commercial aviation. Always in the background, while other bigger jets got all of the headlines, never really getting the appreciation it actually deserved. But if you zoom out and look at what it actually achieved, its impact is really undeniable. Now, the last ever airworthy BAC 111 belonged to Northrop Grumman, who used it as a flying testbed for avionics and other systems, both for military and commercial aircraft. And they actually ended up using 3 BAC 111s in this role in total. On the 6th of March 2019, the last of these jets made its last landing after a suitably dramatic low pass, finishing the last chapter in the history of this fantastic trailblazer of an airliner. From its first flight in 1963 to its final retirement in 2019, the 111 flew for more than 5 decades. That's half a century of service out of an airplane designed as a simple, rugged shuttle. Very few designs can claim that kind of longevity, especially in the punishing world of short-haul operations. And in many ways, the story of this small, chubby, unassuming little jet is a story about European aviation in itself. The industry grew with this aircraft, while those concrete airstrips gave way to proper airports, which now called for more modern and efficient single-aisle jets, as fuel prices got higher and profit margins became more important. But still, this little aircraft's influence is visible in our industry to this day. So what do you make of the BAC 111? Did you ever get a chance to fly on one yourself, or are you a pilot who actually flew one? Let us know in the comments below, and also consider joining my Patreon crew by scanning this QR code. It really helps what we're doing. My name is Peter Hörnfeldt and you're watching Mentour now. Have an absolutely fantastic day and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.